Okay, so the Fed's worst timing imaginable. And this week, the central bank is kicking off its meeting right as the economy has decided to hand it the policy equivalent of a flaming bag of contradictions.
Right? Because apparently the vibe now is weaker jobs, stubborn inflation, higher oil, and um, absolutely no clean answers. Very relaxing, very spa like.
Welcome, everyone. This is Weekly Market Breakdown, and today we're talking about the Fed meeting that starts this week, just as policymakers are walking into one of the messiest mixes they could ask for: a softer labor market, inflation that still is not where they want it, and energy prices making everything feel a little more dramatic.
It is like showing up for an exam and finding out the test is on three subjects, two of them conflict with each other, and one of them is just gas prices.
So here's the setup. The latest jobs data came in weak. The US lost jobs in February, unemployment moved up, and that pushed investors to worry that the labor market may be softening faster than the Fed would like.
Which is never a fun sentence to hear. The labor market is softening sounds gentle, but for actual people, it translates to, fewer openings, shakier leverage, and way more awkward LinkedIn optimism.
Exactly. Under normal conditions, weaker jobs data would make markets think, okay, rate cuts could be getting closer. Because if hiring is cooling and unemployment is rising, the Fed starts worrying more about growth and less about keeping policy extra tight.
Normally, yes, but the economy has decided normal is for cowards.
Because right as the labor market looked weaker, inflation concerns stayed alive, oil prices rose, energy costs became a bigger risk again, and that reopened the fear that inflation may not cool as smoothly as policymakers hoped.
Which is classic inflation behavior. Every time people start saying, "Oh, maybe we are finally getting somewhere," inflation kicks the door open and goes, "Miss me?"
That is what makes this meeting so awkward. The Fed is starting this week with two signals that point in different directions. On one side, weaker jobs argue for more caution about keeping rates too high for too long. On the other side, sticky inflation and higher oil argue for more caution about cutting too soon.
So the Fed is basically in one of those group projects where both sides are technically correct, and somehow that makes everything worse.
And markets know it. Investors have been trying to price whether this meeting will bring a steady hand, a tougher tone, or some hint that cuts are getting pushed further out. The bigger issue is not just what the Fed does right now, it is what it says about the path ahead.
Because now the Fed says one mildly boring sentence, and like 10,000 people immediately act like they just found a treasure map in the wording.
The reason this matters for regular people is pretty straightforward. If rates stay higher for longer, borrowing stays expensive. Mortgages stay painful, car loans stay painful, credit cards remain their usual form of legal emotional damage, and small business borrowing does not get easier.
Credit card rates have become so hostile, they feel less like financial products and more like personal judgments.
And at the same time, if the labor market keeps weakening, people worry about job security, wage growth, and whether employers start pulling back even more on hiring. That is why this story feels so heavy. It is not just one side of the economy, it is both income uncertainty and cost pressure.
Yeah, that is the part people actually experience. Economists call it a policy dilemma. Households call it, why does everything feel expensive and insecure at the same time?
There is also a timing issue. The inflation numbers people are looking at may not fully capture the newest energy pressure yet. So, part of the Fed's problem is that it has to make decisions while knowing the next few reports could look different if oil stays elevated.
Which is a fun twist. The Fed loves data, but sometimes the data is basically saying, I do not know. Ask me again next month after the chaos spreads.
Some analysts think the oil shock may fade and not become a lasting inflation problem. Others worry that if energy costs stay high, inflation expectations could get harder to contain, especially if households and businesses start assuming higher prices are sticking around.
So one camp is saying, do not panic. The other is saying, sure, but maybe keep the panic nearby in case we need it.
And that is where the word stagflation starts creeping back into the conversation. Not because we are automatically in some full blown 1970s replay, but because slower growth plus sticky inflation is exactly the kind of combination policymakers hate.
There's that word again, Kyla, stagflation, which we've discussed in other episodes, and is basically the economy's way of saying, I would like to be disappointing in multiple categories.
If the Fed leans too dovish, markets may think it is underestimating inflation risk. If it leans too hawkish, people may worry it is squeezing a weakening labor market even harder. So there is no clean applause line here, just trade offs.
Which is why central banking is one of the few jobs where saying less somehow creates more headlines.
This is also why the meeting starting this week matters beyond one day's decision. The market wants to know if policymakers see the labor market weakness as a warning sign, or if they still think inflation is the bigger threat. That balance will shape expectations for the rest of the year.
Translation: everyone wants to know whether rate cuts are delayed, denied, or just sitting in policy purgatory.
For workers, this affects the hiring environment. For borrowers, it affects monthly costs. For investors, it affects valuations and risk appetite. And for anyone buying groceries, gas, or anything tied to financing, it changes how stretched life feels.
So basically, even if you do not own stocks, the Fed can still end up co-authoring your budget against your will.
The bigger message here is that this meeting starts this week under conditions that are politically noisy, economically messy, and emotionally very easy for people to understand. Jobs are softer. Prices still hurt. Oil is unhelpful. Nobody gets to feel relaxed.
The entire macro backdrop right now is just one long shrug wearing a suit.
We'll keep watching the Fed, the jobs data, and the inflation picture, so you do not have to decode every policy sentence while also side-eyeing your bank balance and wondering why your supposedly normal expenses keep acting premium.
And if this helped, subscribe, check out the other episodes, and come back next time the economy rolls out another storyline that sounds fake until it hits your rent, your gas tank, or your credit card bill.